Hello again, friends. We are back for another personal yoga training video. I hope you have been enjoying them. I hope they've been helping with your own personal practice and understanding how to get into variations that work better for your body and your own practice. Today's posture is one of those poses that I see so many students just force themselves into without realizing that there are other options. So I'm really excited to share this tutorial today, and that is going to be focused on our pigeon pose, Kapotasana. So pigeon pose is a wonderful, wonderful hip opener. It's wonderful for stretching the legs and for releasing into the lower back, as well as gaining full flexibility and strength in the hips. And it's one of those that if you have tight hips, it can be very difficult to get into. Because there's just not enough space for you to comfortably get into it with how our body aligns on the mat. And so I'll show you what I mean by that here in a second. And I'm going to show you the variations to take instead if our normal pigeon pose is just a little too much, right? And that's okay. Because again, it's about understanding that you need to build up the strength and the flexibility from a starting point. So if that full pigeon pose feels too out of reach, feels like too much stretch, then listen up for these variations, try them out, and then start there. And then eventually you'll have worked up the space to then work into a fuller expression, which is maybe that full pigeon pose. So let's head back to the mat and let's show you what this full pigeon pose looks like so that you can get a refresher of what that looks like as a full variation. But then from there, I'll kind of break down where you can use your props, such as our handy block that I love to point out is such a great tool to have by your mat. Even if you don't touch it throughout your practice, it's there. So grab yourself a block. That's what we're going to be using for our prop today. So from your pigeon pose, a great way to enter is from your downward dog because it creates enough space to really get that knee up to the top of the mat. So for a pigeon pose, we take our right knee towards that right wrist and that right ankle towards that left wrist. And then once you get that knee bent at the top of the mat, you start to settle the hips down towards the mat with that left leg long behind you, right? Or whatever leg you're working on. For example, I'm starting on my right side. So your pigeon pose looks like this when they instruct you to get into it in a yoga class, right? But it may not look like this. If you have tight hips, you may notice that you have to bend the knee deeper and bring that heel in towards the hip. So maybe that's a starting point, right? A lot of teachers cue that you should bring that right ankle or that ankle to that left wrist, or maybe parallel that shin to the top of the mat. But that creates a lot, right? Into this hip area, into the groin, into the glutes. And so if this feels like too much, bend that knee as much as you need. And you may notice you have a little more space to keep those hips square. Because the key is we want our hips square down to the mat, but that means that gravity is pressing those hips down, right? Helping with that opening. And that's why this can be such a difficult posture to hold and to get into, is because you have gravity kind of pressing everything down on you, and it doesn't leave much space down here, right? So that first modification to try is bending that knee as much as we can. The second modification to try, if you notice that you're kind of on this right hip, you're tipping over, right? And you have those hips kind of coming off square from the mat, fill in the gap, take that block and place that underneath the glute there so that you can fill that gap so you don't feel like you're going to fall over. You can feel that steadiness of those hips being square. I'm going to turn here on my mat and show you what that looks like from the side. So again, if you feel like you're kind of dropping off to the side, or if you feel like you're way over here, right? Take that yoga block, place it underneath the glutes, or maybe even a blanket folded, some kind of cushion to help keep those hips square. And then from there, you can maybe fold down and come into that fold aspect of our pigeon pose, right? But still, maybe bending that knee, maybe this just is a lot to have that left leg behind you. Maybe it's a little too much on this back knee, right? And that's okay. If this is too much and you're feeling like even with those little adjustments of using your block, of bending in the knee, it's still too much to hold your pigeon pose, then what I encourage you to do is roll off onto the side, bend into this back knee, and still have this bend in the front knee, but you're creating kind of a 90 degree bend. So you are rolled onto the side of the hip, but you're bending into the back knee, which allows a 90 degree bend in the knees. And then you can still fold over that front leg that we do and we just were working on with that pigeon pose, right? You can still fold over that front leg just like everyone else would be doing, but you're allowing a safety net, right, of that left knee to not feel like it's hurting if that straight leg is too much, and you're still able to get that opening into the hips here, right? So this is a really great option if your pigeon pose is too much. Take your 90, fold, right? The other variation that you can do is your pigeon pose on your back, your figure 4 in your legs. So for that one, like I said, it can be hard to cue this as a modification and a variation to try when we're cueing our normal pigeon pose as a yoga teacher, because it requires you to sit on your seat. Whereas our pigeon pose, we might be coming in from a downward dog, right? So just know that you have this option if you're getting into a pigeon pose in class. It's not being cued, but you know it. It's in the back pocket, right? That's what these tutorials are for, to understand your practice. So to come into your seated figure 4, your seated reclined pigeon, you can either do it from a seat here, planting the hands down and then just taking one ankle on top of the opposite knee, finding that figure 4 in the leg so that knee falls out to the side and you can just start to open it up, right? Still getting the same opening into the hips. Or you can take it one further, lie down onto the back. This is even more comfortable here. It does give a little bit more space for the legs if sitting up felt a little too much. But from here, you can press open that right knee. Maybe you even pick up that figure 4, weave those arms through and interlace behind that left leg so that you can pull that figure 4 in towards the chest while laying back, right? And pressing that right elbow into that right knee or thigh, still opening into that hip and still getting that kind of folding compression here. But we don't have all that weight pressing down in our pigeon pose, right? It's a little bit better for your body here if you were feeling like there was just too much compression in that full variation. So that's your figure 4 recline on your back. Then you have your 90 in your legs for your other variation. And then you have your options to try out bending the knee a little more or placing a block underneath the hip for your full pigeon pose. So those are all the variations and modifications that are within your pigeon pose practice. And I encourage you to use them, because a lot of times it can be just a really deep posture for new yogis who don't necessarily have that space in the hips to immediately go into it. So it's really important to know these variations. Even if you are an experienced yogi and you may have had an injury or you may have been sitting on a plane for a long time, you went on a trip and you're going back into your practice, right? These things are important to have in the back of your mind, because your practice isn't going to be the same every single day, and that's okay. It's a scale that we work on, and it's important to know which variations suit our body best for that particular day, right? And we meet ourselves on our mat in that moment and see what that needs to be. So have grace with yourself as you're starting out. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's great to have all these tools to build up that strength and that foundation, as I've talked about before, to then grow in your practice, right? Because you're actually working upon and building upon something versus just trying to do these shapes that seem unfamiliar and you kind of feel like you're going all over the place, right? So it's just being more intentional about how you move through your practice. So I hope these videos are helping. Let me know what you think about our pigeon pose, if this helps, and I'll be back next week with another yoga training tutorial, and we'll see what pose pops up for then. Don't forget, we have our solstice strengthening series that starts this Saturday. If you're interested, go check out my previous videos where I have a student testimonial as well as a Q&A session that you can dive into, as well as past replays if you want to get started right away. But check out the link in my bio if you're interested in joining us live for our live classes that kick off this Saturday, and I will see you next week.